welcome to those of you who are punctual for the Coase Institute discussion of Gary Libecap's new manuscript on the implication of property rights versus rent seeking in forming institutions. For those of you who don't know, I'm Mary Shirley. I'm the president of the Ronald Coase Institute, and we are very excited to welcome Gary Libecap today to present his new book titled Where's Coase? The Implication of Economic Property Rights or Rent Seeking in Forming Institutions. Gary is a distinguished professor at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management and Economics Department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is also a research associate at the NBER, and his most distinguished office is he is the director of the Ronald Coase Institute. Excuse me. This manuscript reflects Gary's years and years of path-breaking work on the role of property rights in addressing losses of natural resources and on the role of markets in encouraging efficient use and allocation of resources. We're also delighted to welcome our discussant today, who is P.J. Hill, Emeritus Professor of Economics at Wheaton College, who's written extensively on this subject of institutions, property rights, and natural resources. I want to ask you to please use the chat function on your screen to type your question instead of raising your hand virtually or physically to ask your question. You can do this throughout the talk, and by doing it this way, we can get a lot more questions in. After PJ's comments, Alexandra Benham, who's secretary to the board of the Ronald Coase Institute, and Lee Benham, who's emeritus professor of economics at Washington University and also a director of the Ronald Coase Institute, will pose your questions and comments to Gary. And that way, as I said, we'll maximize the number of comments. This presentation is the second lecture from our new book series on institutional economics for Cambridge University Press. It's going to feature and is featuring volumes that synthesize the rich results and patterns that are emerging from a large and growing literature on institutional economics. We'll be inviting you to presentations of other books in this series. And if you have a book idea that's been percolating in your mind, contact us. We are very interested in knowing about it. As always, we also welcome your support to the Ronald Coase Institute. It gives us great encouragement and enables us to assist more young scholars and encourage more research on these critical issues. You can provide support to our work of any amount at our website, www.coase.org, by clicking on the donate button. So let's move right on to our main speaker, Gary Libecap. Please, Gary, we invite you to introduce your manuscript.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. What I'll do is give you an overview of where this came from and identify some key topic issues, and then turn it over to PJ, who will summarize the volume. And I want to say right up front, I'm just so grateful for PJ taking the time to go through this, but also Mary and others who have read through the document and given me really important insights. And then for people who are, as we used to say, tuning in, thanks as well for being part of this. So initially, I've always been interested in Ronald Coase's work. And as we all know, this is probably the most, or one of the most cited papers in economics. And it was part of a literature that excited me when I was, even before I was a graduate student, about the opportunities for welfare improving institutional change. And it's sort of a who's who in terms of the big names in this literature. Ronald Coase, Doug North, Harold Demsitz, Ollie Williamson, Armin Alchian, Joram Barzell, Steve Chung. These were people that in the 1960s, 70s, and really into the early part of the 19 or the 2020s, or the 2000s, uh, were describing these pathways by which institutions could move societies forward. And although I address in the book, but I don't see in any of their work explicit references to this uh, market failure literature that they were implicitly countering. And the market failure literature associated with Samuelson, Baythor, Baumol, and others laid out the claim that private markets could not deal with a variety of problems, and one of them in particular was externalities. And that basically, because we had this market failure argument, it called for more centralized responses or approaches. Um, and this was really, at least the way I interpret Coase's 1960 piece, as a counter to that. That basically he laid out a framework, not a pathway, well, pathway, but not a blueprint for addressing externalities, that they were not necessarily evidence of market failure, that there could be cases, in fact, perhaps many cases, where property rights could be defined and exchanged in a decentralized way to address externalities. I might just say here, uh, I find it surprising in a way how the environmental economics literature really has grabbed a hold of not Coase's solution so much, but as Coase caution that transactions costs could be high in terms of defining and trading property rights. And so it might not always be practical. And that the environmental economics literature is really run with that. And I'll come back to that. But basically, using the notion without really empirical investigation of why Coasean approaches, decentralized Coasean approaches, are not that useful. Intellectually interesting, but not practical. Now, as it turns out, we'll see that none of the U.S. environmental policies enacted from 1970 forward, and that's really the 1970 is the threshold from which almost all of them appear, initially include Coasean approaches. And the issue is it transactions costs, which, as I just mentioned, the environmental economics literature tends to see, or is this something else, that rent seeking? And I also want to say right up front, I don't mean rent seeking in a pejorative way. I mean it in a positive way in the sense of trying to identify what it is that motivates agents to engage in institutional formation. Is it the transactions cost reduction efficiency arguments that we saw in the earlier literature, or is it something different associated with Ann Kruger and Gordon Tullock? So in my investigation, I do not find that transactions cost reductions or transactions costs are the key reason, but in fact, rent seeking is prevalent throughout all U.S. environmental legislation. So going back to the initial very positive literature, I asked the question, well, why did it go wrong? Well, it didn't go wrong in focusing on private decentralized institutional formation. Because in that case, the agents capture are the residual claimants to any of those efficiency gains. And so they see cases where transactions costs impede profits or profitable adjustments, and where feasible, they adjust, they contract or bargain to change institutions and allow for more exchange and new institutional formation. And I think this is especially the case in Williamson's work. There is a huge literature, especially in the strategy literature, about how firms have adjusted through hierarchy, the use of a number of other institutional modifications in firm structure to go forward. And so it's been very successful there. But this literature has not been successful, at least in the policy area. Their transactions costs reductions are less relevant because the agents are not the residual claimants of those gains. And who are these agents? Well, they're politicians, agency officials, and lobby group members. Okay. And so they lobby the political process for gains that are not necessarily efficient ones, but they are ones that advance their specific interests. So what are these rents? Well, in the case of environmental programs, and I used that to get traction, uh, they are professionally or politically or philosophically really normative benefits. They also can get commercial benefits in some cases, but these are all assigned via centrally mandated policies. And you see very few property rights or tradable instruments in them. And so what this does is it provides non-competitive returns for less than what these agents would have to pay in a market. Okay. So in fact, cost considerations, as we'll see in the environmental legislation, are often prohibited. And so that would raise the question. That's very un-Coasean. And the question would be, well, why would that be? Why would you prohibit cost considerations? But that's very prevalent. Okay. So the outcome of this is public goods are provided, but at higher cost. And general citizens have high collective action costs and information costs to counter. So it's only if these things become very costly might they then mobilize in some manner to counter them. So how did I get to this point? Well, I didn't start off this way. Initially, I was going to examine in a very, at least I thought, traditional way of looking at transactions costs in a variety of property rights situations. And the first case I thought to look at was at fisheries. It's an area that I'm familiar with, long-standing open access problems. We have had a huge long-standing literature in economics about how to deal with these things, going back to 1954 and Scott Gordon, and then Tony Scott in 1955, and Francis Christie in the 1970s. But what we'll see, and I'll just move forward for a moment, see if you look at property rights regimes. So it isn't that we didn't know about how to deal with these things, and certainly fishers would know, but at least academically and potentially in policy, we had a way to deal with this. But if you look at this worldwide map of catch shares, that is the right to fish within a cap, you find them amazingly limited. And this schematic that was put together by colleagues of mine at Santa Barbara does not really include the vast number of variations within them. But if you look, for example, you have Iceland, New Zealand, early leaders. Then you have Australia, the US, Canada, Chile, and Peru. But beyond that, it's pretty empty. Now, these are all basically the same resource in the sense they're oftentimes highly migratory, non-observable species or resources. So it doesn't seem on the face of it that it could be the case that property rights regimes, transactions costs are the reason that we don't see more property rights. We don't see them extensively in Europe, and we don't see them extensively in Asia, for example, and then elsewhere in Latin America. So what I thought, this is interesting. I wonder if I look more broadly at Coase's initial framework or question about externality mitigation, if I find a similar pattern of the absence of property rights due to rent seeking and not transactions costs there. And so, but But just before I jumped into that, I looked more broadly at property rights worldwide. And this is from the Property Rights Alliance, DeSoto's group, but basically you can find these kinds of maps on the internet. And in fact, in the Nobel lectures of Acemoglu, Simon, and Robinson, they also reproduce maps like this that basically show the tremendous variation in property rights regimes in terms of security and tradability around the world. And again, the literature laying out the benefits has been out there for a long time, and yet somehow, for some reason, much of the world is not grabbing a hold of them, uh, of that opportunity. And so that's why I decided to, well, I can't look at all of the property rights in the world, but I'm going to go focus on the environmental side of things. So what I do is I look at the Clean Air Act, which is the most pervasive environmental law in this country, and I think in many ways probably the most costly. Uh, the Endangered Species Act, which has been argued to be the most powerful environmental law in the world, and the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Act. And what I find across all three of these is that you have centralized regulation, a cap, uh, mandates that are driven not by economics, but by biology, health, and normative values. Okay. And so these things don't just fall out of the sky. These are actually the outcome of the political process. And when I look through the political process, I do not see that decentralized negotiations were ever examined or ever found to be too costly to proceed. In fact, in the case of the Endangered Species Act, it was all set up to engage in the purchase of critical habitat. This was in the prior legislation, and it was ignored and not taken. And so the question would be why? So we do. And the other thing that's interesting about most environmental problems is they're pretty local. And so there's the potential there for small numbers or relatively homogeneous parties to address the problems. But instead, what we get are national uniform mandates that don't consider the many varied costs and benefits associated with environmental law, environmental restrictions. So what we end up with are public goods provided at high cost, and none of them seemingly at a place where marginal costs and marginal benefits are equalized. Okay. And this is really not in the interest of advocates. I've gone through the legislative histories, and I've also looked at law reviews, of which there are many. And what you find is general statements, for example, with the Clean Air Act, that local arrangements were too fragmentary and not working. But there's never a baseline of what is meant by, well, what does not working mean? Okay. But there's a movement directly towards the centralized regulation. And you do see statements both in congressional debates, but then also in these law reviews, which get into the details of the effort to adopt a New Deal style centralized approach to addressing what were called national problems, even though, as I said, they were not national problems generally. So what can we learn broadly from this? So we get environmental laws that, despite many benefits, are probably too costly and too extensive to be welfare improving at the level in which they're provided. You don't see in the environmental economics literature broad evaluations of the cost. For example, with the Clean Air Act, you see lots of measures of health benefits, of which there are many, but no discussion of what really is lost in the costs of industrial production. And it could be that the Clean Air Act contributed to, at least in some way, to the deindustrialization of the American economy and the shifting overseas of of much industrial production. Back to the question is, do we learn something from this pattern of environmental regulation for institutional formation more generally? And I think the argument that I lay out in the last chapter of the book is that the arguments made by proponents for various kinds of legislation is market failure, and normative arguments, not empirical tests, but normative arguments are presented as justification, and the political agents themselves are clear beneficiaries. But the regulated parties that don't get the opportunity to negotiate, as well as society as a whole, are the ones that bear the costs. Now, in the United States, where institutions are reasonably strong, the overall costs imposed on society could be quite limited. But I think that's probably not the case in places where institutional frameworks and protections are less prevalent. So to conclude, I think, or my assertion is that these patterns of rent seeking and environmental legislation limiting a more decentralized approach to dealing with economic problems gives us insights as to why these are more limited worldwide, as I just indicated in that worldwide map. So thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Before we go on to the discussant, let me remind you that if you have questions or comments, please type them into the chat function, and we'll get to them later, rather than try to raise your hand at the end of the discussion. So let me now ask P.J. Hill, who is our discussant, to please give his comments or remarks to Gary. P.J.
Okay. Well, it probably appears kind of redundant to have me talking about Gary's book right after he has summarized the book. So, but I'll go through it nevertheless and give you a little bit of a perspective. He's really summarized the book, and so I'll probably be recapitulating what Gary has put forward there. Basically, I think you can summarize the book with two statements. Number one, what did Coase say? And then number two, what's happened with what he said? What about the implementation of Coase's ideas? I'll do a little bit more than make those two statements. And so the book really lays out very well the whole Coasean argument. Of course, starting with Coase goes back in some sense to Coase's 1937 article, but then of course the 1960 article, the follow-up by Harold Demsetz, by Steve Chung. So it lays out the whole institutional framework that basically Coase makes the argument about how do you deal with conflicting claims over property rights. And that's really what it's all about. We sometimes use the term externality. Actually, I think the argument that it's really about conflicting claims is a bit more insightful. So Gary goes through all of that, a very nice job of going through those arguments, following the literature over the years that follow. He also places it nicely in the sense of the larger new institutional economics. He puts it within the context of the whole effort to understand institutions and the effort to think about those sorts of things through a transaction cost sort of a framework. And of course, also deals with the market failure arguments of A.C. Pigou. So there's all of that's in those chapters. But then, of course, one of the innovations in these first chapters is, well, if Coase isn't adopted, why? So he develops a very cogent theory of rent seeking, of the political arena, because basically, as he pointed out in his remarks, Coase deals with the issue of property rights, transaction costs, uses lots of examples. Coase does not give us a theory of political action. And so Gary gives us one, and it's not just a statement that there are political forces, but he has an actual theory of what rent-seeking is, who are the people that are trying to impose rent-seeking sorts of efforts. So that comes out of the theory chapters, and that's probably one of the really important additions, is the melding of Coasean theory of transaction costs and conflicting claims with a theory of political action. And then, as Gary's pointed out, he does take up the three important case studies: the Clean Air Act, the 1976 Fisheries Act, and then the Endangered Species Act. Of course, most of these are coming in the 1970s. By that time, Coase is well understood. In a sense, you could say, Coase has won the battle, or Coase is victorious in the academic world, in the world of ideas. But the question is, why is that not translated into the particular arena? So it's very nice to have Gary then give very cogent, detailed explanations of these sorts of acts. And it's not just listing them, it goes through them, talks about all of the amendments to the acts, talks about the reaction in the academic community. So you'll see, if you go through these chapters, you'll find who was making the arguments politically, what was the reaction academically, institutionally, all of those sorts of things. Now, Gary's not arguing that the environmental efforts were fruitless. He says, yes, we do have air that is cleaner. We did get results from this particular legislation. So it's not an argument that these sorts of things were just prima facie wrong, but that they were not paying much attention to things about how far do you want to go, what's the reaction on the margins, are there regional sorts of differences, all those sorts of things. And he does point out, with regard to clean air, we do have examples of local efforts or limited efforts to do something about it. The SO2 regulations were basically a Coasean solution, and Reclaim, a project within the LA basin, was also one that did that. So there's some examples of that. The other thing that Gary is not arguing is that it's clear that the Coasean solutions were the right ones for all those sorts of solutions. He's saying, at least we should have talked about it. There should have been some consideration. And so as he goes through those debates and has lots of discussion of what was proposed, what was argued about, what was adopted, he correctly points out that there just isn't much there in terms of discussion of Coase. And so that's the interesting sort of a thing that comes out of that. We do see some Coasean solutions. Gary argues that it's not completely void of Coase, and you get to the fisheries after some 20 years of trying kind of top-down regulation, Pigouvian sorts of solutions. Then you do get some on the margin after kind of the failure of fisheries regulation. Then we do see some Coasean rights and some Coasean trading. It's very late, it's very limited, and it certainly isn't there in the debates throughout. And then, of course, the Endangered Species Act, a clear case of where there are costs, very substantial sorts of costs that are imposed upon particular people, particularly those who have habitat that's important for species. And so there, again, there's just no consideration of the Coasean sorts of solutions. One interesting thing that really does point out that it is really just driven by politics is the fact that there are really not hardly any Pigouvian taxes. If you're truly Pigouvian, you'd be thinking about all sorts of regulations, but you'd be thinking about taxes. Taxes are unpopular politically. And so the political arena says, even if you're going with Pigou, you go with regulations rather than going with Coasean sorts of solutions. The arguments with regard to the acts is very nuanced. Gary goes through the legislation, talks about who was involved, what were the goals that they were trying to achieve. So it's not just simply a statement of the regulations. And I would say that it was in that area that I really learned a lot about what the debate was going on. The first three chapters where the theories presented, also very useful. So all of that then means that it's a book that takes up some very, very important questions with regard to the Coasean arguments. I would point out, in some sense, you could say this is very political, but this is not a political screed. This is not trying to beat up on your enemies. This is a very thoughtful, careful analysis going through. He's not using rent-seeking in a pejorative way. He's saying this is how you think about efforts to try to get things to the political arena that you don't really have to pay the cost for. And particularly when there's organized groups that can do things there that are particularly useful. Last thing I would say is if and when you read the book, and I hope that you do, pay attention to the quotes at the beginning of each chapter and the footnotes. Gary, I don't know how you have this library of quotes, but at the beginning of each chapter, there's usually 3, sometimes 4 quotes from all sorts of important thinkers. And so that's just one of the great delights of reading the book, is looking at the beginning of the chapters and the quotes that are there. And then the footnotes, of course, are copious, well-researched, so the argument is well supported by what goes on. So that's pretty much what kind of a recap of what Gary was saying, but it is an important, well-argued book, both at the discussion of Coase, the theory, the development of the theory of political action, and then the follow-up with a discussion of 3 major cases in the U.S.
Okay, PJ. Let me second PJ in saying how original this book is, particularly in the level of rich detail on the environmental legislation that Gary presents. I also learned an enormous amount reading this book. And let me remind everyone to please put your questions and comments in the chat function. I'm going to turn the floor over now to Lee and Alexandra Benham, and they will go through your comments and questions and pose them to Gary or PJ if they choose. So Lee, please.
It's been a wonderful experience hearing both of you speak this morning, Gary and PJ. Fascinating work and beautifully and tersely summarized. So there are many good questions, and let's just start with in chronological order that they've been asked. And the first question is from Henry Mormon. Gary, he asks you to comment on how formulating actual solutions to specific environmental problems gets solved by state regulators at the state level.
Well, what I did is I looked at the Clean Air Act, and the nice thing about the Clean Air Act is that's the Clean Air Act of 1970 deals specifically with local intrastate problems, and you don't really see interstate issues arising until the 1990 amendments. And then you get the sulfur dioxide national trade in 1995. And so for 25 years or so, it's all intrastate. And as I mentioned, these things have been dismissed as being fragmented or not working, but I just didn't see that. Now, Henry asked more specifically about how parties get together, and I have to admit, I did not go into specific how specific problems were addressed in a particular location. I did go into detail about Pittsburgh, for example, And Karen Clay had recommended at Carnegie Mellon that I look at Pittsburgh in more detail. And there were a variety of meetings within the Pittsburgh region, not Pennsylvania broadly, but because the smoke pollution was very localized. And the industries, leaders, labor unions, city councils, county governments, and so forth, representatives getting together to address pollution. Pollution was a health problem, and pollution was a problem that in terms of lowering property values. On the other hand, if industry closes and incomes fall, there are also health problems and there are also property value effects. And so what I found is that these parties were very concerned about weighing costs and benefits and trade-offs in trying to address these problems. So it wasn't that they were oblivious to it or dismissive, that they in fact were quite concerned about how to proceed. Okay.
Or Alexandra, do you have another question?
Yes, or leave the next question.
Yes, well, Gary, first of all, thank you very much on this. This is a question that reflects several of the comments here for both you and PJ. And that is specific examples, that may be small or whatever, specific examples where the Coasean approach has been used. So maybe, Gary, you could give us some illustration, and then PJ.
Well, so Coase is really decentralized arrangements. And when you look at national environmental problems or legislation, it tends to preclude local arrangements. That being said, there is quite a rich literature. Bob Ellickson at Yale has, well, I don't know, he has a book called Property, where basically he goes through and looks at homeowners associations, how they deal with localized problems. There are a couple of papers in environmental economics where people go through and look at localized cases where parties get together. Now, PJ will be pretty familiar with the use of easements, where environmental groups or in some cases local governments purchase land in order to provide critical habitat in the case of the Endangered Species Act. And then in terms of the Clean Water Act, which also imposes national standards, but it's been less costly because agriculture was sufficiently politically influential to be out of that. So non-point water pollution is not regulated, but point pollution is. And so but you still get pollution, of course. And so there are negotiations with agricultural producers, farmers, and so forth, to engage in a number of land use practices changes in order to mitigate or reduce water pollution. So this is a general response. There is a literature out there. Casey Mulligan, also at Chicago, has a recent paper in Public Choice where he goes through and lays out a number of cases where local parties got together and solved problems. And the reason why, in a sense, it's kind of hard to come up with these is that they are so routine. The parties capture the gains and they proceed and go forward. So it doesn't turn out to be newsworthy. Where it gets newsworthy is when it becomes centralized and you can't engage in these things. But PJ probably has some good examples to present on local solutions to these problems.
Well, thank you. I didn't have to pay Lee to bring that up, but basically Terry Anderson might work on the American West in the 19th century. That's where you see lots of local solutions dealing with questions like Gary's work on mining camps. There were conflicting claims. They were worked out locally by all sorts of mining camp associations. They paid attention to transaction costs, and Gary's work that looks about the different types of ore that was being mined, the costs of defining the rights, were they surface, were they underground, all of those sorts of things were pretty much recognized in the 19th century. Terry and I work on ownership of livestock. We look at Indian rules, American Indians. Before the too much pressure from the federal government, had all sorts of transaction cost reducing forms. The idea of this major tribe, the tribe was not very much of an institutional organization that did much. It was mostly the band or the clan at a very local level. Now, you can look at water rights. Water rights evolved at the local level. However, when you get to the 20th century, it really turns around. The whole loss of federalism and going to national control. Land, of course, gets controlled by the national government in the American West. It's a regulatory approach. You get the Bureau of Reclamation that tries to solve in 1902, that tries to work with water. American Indians really get governed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs at a very national level. But if you go back historically, there really are some very nice cases of local arrangements. But Gary's point about when property rights are defined either by custom or by local legislation, you get solutions, and we don't think much about it. And so it's interesting to say that there are lots of solutions that we can look at.
Well, Vladimir Dubrovsky asks a question at a different level. He asks, are there any real-world examples of a successful practical application of the Coasean approach to externalities at a fully national level?
I'm sorry, Alexandra, on a national or subnational?
A fully national, a whole national level, at the national level.
Well, the problem with national is that it becomes centralized, and the legislation invariably precludes local solutions. And so it becomes harder empirically to address. Now, the two cases that I want to mention on that score, one is oil and gas that I looked at some time ago. Even though the problems of waste in terms of competitive extraction were recognized as, in a sense, a national problem, the solutions had to be local because production is local, and the parties are local, and the resource itself is local. And for the most part, the United States has state by state laws or regulations that are really put together by industry bargaining with regards to unitization and pro-rationing and so forth. So that's an example. But back with fisheries, I mentioned that the Magnuson-Stevenson Act was passed in 1976. So worldwide, there's a race to fish. And yet fish are quite localized, even highly migratory ones. So we have some based on feed, water temperature, and so forth. And so you have certain species in certain parts of the country, certain coastal areas. And the initial legislation precluded the ability of parties to really deal with that, but they're very heterogeneous in any event, so it's going to be difficult. But what they did do was, unlike the Clean Air Act, for example, is they created 8 regional management councils. So that was an improvement. And then the councils were able then to deal with more localized problems. Now, had the councils been structured so they were totally producers, that is, parties that depended upon the pecuniary value of the fish stock, as well as ecological concerns. But if they had clear property rights and then opened it up for exchange, then I think the story would have ended. It turns out these regional fishery management councils had broad participation. So you get academics, you get members of environmental NGOs, as well as a variety of different kinds of fishery groups. And they do not have a clear property right for exchange. And so basically, although it's quite an improvement over the Clean Air Act, which has nothing regional like this, nevertheless, it's very difficult for the parties to get together because there is no tradable instrument to address these problems. So back to the question, do we see much in the way of national successes? At least in my overview of U.S. environmental policies, no. That doesn't mean there aren't public goods provided, because there are, but they're provided at higher cost and more extensively than is probably welfare improving.
Well, Gary, thank you very much. One of the questions, can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So Catherine asked the following question. It shows up in various contexts here about the distributional effects being a major driver with this. And I'd like to start off with Mary giving a short discussion about Larry Summers' problem with regard to Haiti and garbage.
Me?
Sorry?
You're asking me?
Yes.
I'm sure I don't know what you're referring to, Lee. Sorry.
Okay, but basically, Larry Summers got into big trouble because of his
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, Larry Summers got into big trouble because he signed a memo, which was written by a colleague of mine at the World Bank, which said that poor countries should not be concerned about dumping of environmental pollutants or fee on their properties, because if those pollutants killed people with diseases that occurred in people who were older than the lifespan of the people in that country, which was a pretty callous argument,
Right.
to say the least.
But basically, the general point is the distributional effects are very important. So maybe both Gary and PJ could respond about, has that changed? What can you say about distributional impact on the way this plays out?
Well, I'll speak to it quickly and then turn it over to PJ. So distribution is huge. Now, if there's a property right and it's tradable, then you can address distributional concerns. It may not fit your normative or philosophically desired distribution, but basically the asset can be moved around in a way. And so I view really environmental degradation or environmental externality as a potential asset, in the sense that we see too much land use of a particular kind that is inflicting costs, and for some they would want to mitigate that. So it has value, and so potentially could be exchanged. And so if there is a property right of some type, then these distributional issues can be addressed. Where I find it more problematic, frankly, in the environmental legislation is that distributional issues are raised by people who are not bearing them directly, academics in particular, but oftentimes environmental NGOs. And this can also play into the way in which politicians respond. But basically, with statements that, for example, that we need you see this actually in the congressional debates on the Clean Air Act, that we need national air quality standards because it would be inappropriate to have clean air in some places and dirty air elsewhere. Well, of course, that's a distributional claim and it's a normative one, but it imposes economic costs on certain parties that they're not able to negotiate around. And so distribution is huge and it comes up in fisheries. But again, the big advocates for the restrictions on trade in U.S. fisheries on catch shares are largely academics who want the property right assigned to maintain a more traditional, low capital fishery and not a more highly capital intensive fishery. And they assign a property right in that way through policy. And then those rights are not tradable. And so you lock in a sense, inefficient production practices. And so where does that lead in a world that's demanding fish protein is that it leads to greater imports from elsewhere. So it doesn't really solve a distributional problem so much as keeping some people in a traditional manner and poor. PJ?
Yeah, I think much the same as what Gary said. The environmental movement, you can, try to date it as beginning in the 1970s, perhaps earlier, but basically it's an expression of concern or care. And so the US environmental movement, and in a sense worldwide, says we care. We care about things that haven't been appropriately articulated in terms of our level of concern. But then that means that there's a particular group of people that are very articulated about that have a lot of access to expressions of those sorts of concerns. It makes for the effort to organize, do all of those sorts of things easier. And as it turns out, those sorts of places want to satisfy their desires. And as you would expect, when you want to satisfy your desires, you want to do it in the cheapest way possible without paying for it or not for paying for all of the costs. And so it's just kind of part of the intellectual history of the US in the beginning of the environmental movement that these sorts of concerns are expressed, but then they get expressed politically. And Gary's point about you can't, there's a sense in which you can argue that much of what was going on was satisfying people, perhaps in the upper half of the income distribution. But the particular thing is that, in some of the legislation and in some of the judicial decrees, they actually said you cannot consider costs in terms of doing it. And Gary has a great discussion of that. So that means really that you can't care about some of the distributional sorts of issues. So, and there's a very real sense in which environmental legislation created both political gains and pecuniary gains for people, not much attention at all to some of the distributional sorts of aspects. So I just actually think it was left out of much of the concern, except that the way our political system is set up, if you're organized and you're articulate and you can put together some concerns about particular issues, then those issues really became the ones that were paid attention to. And they were not paid attention to by granting any sorts of quasi rights that could be traded away. They were paid attention to by granting particular privileges in the political arena.
Great. Well,
I just quickly follow up. I just saw a question, Ray. There are two points. One is there's quite a discussion, particularly at my institution, on environmental justice. And mostly this has to do, so it's a distributional issue, and it has to do with pollution, air pollution, water pollution, or what have you. And so all those are legitimate issues to be concerned about. What you don't see is the downsides, in the case of the Clean Air Act, of uniform restrictions on or uniform standards on air quality, and how that, in a sense, forced the closure of plants and limited their migration across the country. And so what that means is for people who have very industry and plant specific skills that do not transfer, those people do not get compensated and they effectively lose their jobs. I just could not. There is some discussion of that in the environmental economics literature, but not enough. And so my point there is that there are distributional effects everywhere, but more attention ought to be paid, seemingly, to the trade-offs imposed or inflicted from these uniform standards. Now, the other point I wanted to come back to real quickly is I saw someone raise the question about turfs or tradable fishing rights within particular areas. And the Magnuson-Stevens Act is, and then worldwide, is an outlier in some sense. And I think it's because the fishing industry was sufficiently homogeneous in terms of lobbying so that you do get a lot of institutional innovation that you don't find elsewhere in U.S. environmental legislation, but that is pretty positive.
Well, you've dealt with a lot of the question that Phil Kiefer wanted to ask you. Maybe there's one or two things more you might say. He asks, is the environment different? For example, the 1970s had an era of significant deregulation of the financial world, airlines, rail, trucking, and so forth. He asks, perhaps voters are more inclined to ignore regulatory costs in the case of environmental issues than others?
Well, I think the problem is that it's very hard to disentangle public goods from more particularistic goods. And so if you're a general citizen and you have claims, for example, about the Endangered Species Act and its benefits, or the Clean Air Act and its benefits, um, you do see the air is cleaner. You do see ostensibly that certain species are listed. And so that's what you have. What you will have less ability to less information on is what the costs are, because those costs are in some cases prohibited in determination, so we don't have information on them. We don't rely on taxes, which would be more explicit in costs. So you get the certainty of regulation, and general citizens have, as I mentioned earlier, a collective action problem, but also an information problem about how to deal with it. And these are far more formidable in the environmental one than in the areas of airline deregulation or utility deregulation that took place in the latter part of the 20th century.
Thank you, Gary. A couple of points. Not everybody here will know the influence of Coase in China. It's not as if Coase doesn't have a real world impact. Coase got the credit, or substantial amount of the credit, for the change in China which permitted tradable goods, and that is by more clearly defining the property rights to land. And once that was done, the government still owned it, and it was tradable. Second point is, Throwen is online here. I think Iceland was a case where at the national level they dealt, as far as I understand, with the fisheries issue at the national level. Okay. And finally here, I would like, and maybe Alexander could ask the question here. Phil Good is online here. He's the editor for the series, and he says, we are extremely pleased to have Gary's book as one of the first in the new series. Having such an original book by a significant scholar sends a strong signal about what we hope to achieve with this series. Thank you very much, Phil. So Alexander, if you have a question.
Yes, this is from Jordan Adamson. Gary, he asks, can you comment on the possibilities for market design? From someone not deep into the environmental literature, it seems like the label market failure might be applied to situations where there isn't actually a market.
Good.
So, that's a challenging one, and PJ may have some insights on this as well. Basically, and I think people, especially those associated with Joram Barzell, Alchin, and really early North, uh, markets and Demsits, markets emerge spontaneously, so you don't need market design if private agents are not restricted from doing so. And so if there's some kind of uh, problem, economic problem that emerges in land use or production or what have you, parties can get together and negotiate solutions. So that is, in a sense, a spontaneous development of a market. Where the market failure argument is at a much higher level of abstraction, but it leads itself directly into policy. And so if Samuelson, Beator, in fact, Beator's 1954 paper lists a whole series of potential market failures. Uh, Economies of scale, arguing that firms would stay too small and not capture the broader benefits that their uh, uh, innovation or product lines might generate. And so therefore you'd want subsidies, and this leads to industrial policies. Um, and and then of course environmental externalities. Now, so there may be truth, empirical truth to these claims. The question, at least that I think of, is, well, what is the alternative? If it's not going to be addressed in a decentralized way, then would the intrusion or introduction of the state be an improvement? And there, I think it depends on what the incentives of the state actors would be. And it's not obvious to me that these efficiencies that drove that earlier literature would be primary drivers. So the the arguments that come up in the environmental literature are that we needed another New Deal, and we see this now in terms of the Green New Deal to move things forward. If you look at, I haven't done this, but Price Fishback and others have looked at the New Deal itself, and in a very positive manner. He had no axe to grind, but he finds that the New Deal had very mixed effects. In some cases had positive ones, in many cases not so much. And so, but that's not reflected. It becomes a rhetorical piece to advance a particular style or objective in regulation. So I don't know if PJ has
Well, I just think
additional thoughts
the
here.
term market failure is interesting because it really doesn't tell you much. You could use other ways of talking about the same sort of thing. You could say, well, there's government failure. You could say there's institutional failure, and really what Coase was saying was there's high transaction costs of solving the problem or helping us with coordination across time and space. So if you think about, okay, so there's transaction costs of trying to solve the coordination problem. You can call it market failure, but that doesn't tell you how do you try to solve that problem. I mean, it's usually meant that, well, markets aren't working, we have to replace them with something. And instead, if you just go back and say, well, there's conflicting claims over property rights, actions that you can take, what are the ways of reducing them? And Coase's argument that better defining the property rights. And as Gary points out, in some of the national environmental problems, there was clearly a role for government intervention. So, but the question is then, in what ways do you intervene? So the whole question of market failure is just kind of this confusing one that has been used as a political cudgel that doesn't give you much information about how you're going to deal with this coordination problem. And so it's nice if you can move beyond it, because it just carries all sorts of supposed solutions. And that's what Gary is really, what the 3 case studies show is these efforts to try to deal with what they would have, what we might have called market failure on water, air, endangered species, were very costly, didn't pay attention to transaction costs. So that's not a very good answer, but just to say that I don't find the term market failure very helpful.
I might just add to that. There are market failure typically means in some ways that the costs of getting parties together, defining property rights, and exchanging them are high. And so we don't observe it. And so one clear response to that would be for identifying what the problems are and then trying to reduce the costs of transactions. Coase's initial argument really dealt with bilateral negotiations, which are his parables were pretty simple ones. So when you get beyond that, then there is an opportunity, if for in some cases for the state or other organizations to provide a framework for parties to get together, then that would be a response. But that's not what I find in environmental legislation. Instead, it's a quick leap to a Pigouvian, more centralized regulation.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for a very stimulating discussion. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm sure we could go on for hours, and it would be so much fun to do that. I think Gary has written a path-breaking and stimulating and original book. I hope you will all now have gotten a taste of it. Will go out and buy the book once it's published, and also look for others in our series on Cambridge University Press. Thank you again for your attention, and we hope you will also attend future workshops such as this or meetings such as this on our upcoming manuscripts. Thanks again, and I wish you all a great day.